Hi, I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm David Barton.
And we're back with another episode of Footsteps to Freedom. Now, we've talked about government and how they function, how they operate. We've talked about philosophies of government. And one of the things unique in some governments are constitutions. As we mentioned, there's 7 different kinds of government, and not every government has a constitution or even a written constitution. Now, America, we have a written constitution, but where did the idea come from that people would actually write down a constitution?
You know, there's several things that came together for a written constitution. One is that makes sure your leaders know what's right and wrong and what the laws are. So as John Adams said, this is a government of laws, not of men.
So the king can't arbitrarily change whatever
That's
law
right.
he doesn't like and say, you know, I know we said that at one point, but I've changed my mind. So it's something to even keep and check the leaders. And that way everybody knows what's right and wrong. It's not one person just picking something they like in the moment, they don't like the next day. So it's a boundary put around not just the people, but also the leaders can see right and wrong.
Under the American system, where we believe all men are created equal and men is the mankind, that's men and women, that puts our leaders and the lowest citizen on the same level. They all have the same laws to follow, and they all know what the laws are, which is another reason they had a written constitution. As a matter of fact, when you look back in the Bible, God, when He got His people out of Egypt and got them out in the wilderness and said, let's make you into a nation, He gave them laws, but they were written laws. As a matter of fact, when you look at something like the 10 Commandments, the Bible says they were written with the finger of God. He wrote them down. And then as they got later into monarchs and had kings, the requirement was that the king, before he could be sworn in, before he could be inaugurated, the king had to make a handwritten copy with his own hand of all the laws. That way he knew the laws. So the concept of written laws actually goes back to the Bible, and that's what God set as a precedent.
And we've talked about the fact that with the founding of America, there were people influenced by the Bible. The founding fathers were familiar with the Bible. So would it be a stretch to think that maybe they're seeing a biblical example? Because at the time when America is founded, how many other nations had written constitutions that they would have used as an example and said, okay, we're going to do what that nation did?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. The nation that's closest to America is, at that time, the mother nation, Great Britain, because we're English citizens, have been English citizens. We've been English from the beginning, and yet the English do not have a written constitution. So it was not like we were copying the traditions that we had come from. We're saying, no, we need a written constitution. That's what they have in the Scriptures. That limits all people. All people are equal at that point. And it is, again, a government of laws, not of men.
Now, at that point, England did have written laws. You can back up in history, and they had the Magna Carta, which gave rights to people and said the king can't violate these rights.
There was even a British Bill of Rights. So in addition to the Magna Carta, you had a Bill of Rights. So they had certain things written down, but a constitution, they still to this day do not have a written constitution.
So a system for how we will rule a nation, how we will operate in the nation. So that's not really clarified or even specified to this day in Britain. And that's something we did in America, so that would be different from the mother nation where we came from. So the idea, certainly you can see it in the Bible. Certainly it's something that we've done in America. How does this really help a nation be different or be unique? Or actually, does it really even help that much? Because if you have good leaders, doesn't that kind of solve the problem? You don't have to have the best constitution if you have a great leader.
That was a debate that happened in early America. Founders of some of our colonies, like William Penn, who came from England to found Pennsylvania, he got into the discussion of whether you need good laws rather than good leaders. As a matter of fact, when the Carolina colony was founded, John Locke, English philosopher, was one of the key people who wrote the Constitution for Carolina colony, and in it everything was focused on having lots of laws to regulate bad people, make sure you had good leaders. Now, when William Penn came later from England and started Pennsylvania, he said, you know, good laws are good, but good leaders are more important. Because if you have good laws and bad leaders, they're going to ignore the written laws. Now, if you have good leaders, they're not going to pass bad laws. So you had this kind of philosophy difference where some said it's all about having good laws, and some said it's all about having good leaders. And by the time we get to the American Constitution, we kind of brought both of those together. When you look at the American Constitution, so many other governments had constitutions in those days. France had a constitution. But just in the first decade of the American Constitution, France has gone through several constitutions. The difference was that America tried to build its Constitution on principles, not on specifics. And one of the reasons that constitutions in the history of the world only average about 17 years is they do it based on what's happening right there at the time, and they're very specific as to this or that. The American Constitution, we tried to take principles. And when you take principles and you get broader, then you can say, all right, good leaders and good laws, we need both of them to come together.
And I think the American Constitution is also fairly unique in the sense that the people have the ability to change things when they need to. In the American Constitution, actually, there's an amendment process where if the people say, hey, you know what, we really think there should be something in our Constitution, it's a law that all of us need to follow and it's not clearly specified to this point, the people have the ability to change the process, change that law, and this is something that actually we've done in America. There's 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The first 10 were called the Bill of Rights, and that was done shortly after the Constitution. But there have been 16 or 17, I guess, in this situation, times after the Bill of Rights that people have said we need to change it. However, 17 changes, 230 plus years, that's not a lot of changes to a Constitution, considering how long we've lived under that Constitution.
When you look at the Constitution, a requirement that it has is that if you're going to change it, you got to have a really strong consensus. The people have to really want this. It can't be superficial changes, because that can often be like a democracy. On the heat of the moment, on the feelings and the emotions of the time, we're going to make a change. Well, the Constitution says it's okay to make changes, but here's what you have to do. You have to get 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify. And so one of the things that's given stability is we don't let those emotions run us off into wild directions at the time. We stay, and while there have been 17 amendments after the original 10, so 27 total amendments, there have been more than 10,000 amendments proposed to the U.S. Constitution. Most of them don't go anywhere because they don't have that wide support. So having wide support helps the people be behind the government. It helps the government keep up with what the people are wanting when the people really want it, if they want it that bad. And so that is a cool provision of the Constitution. Is we're not necessarily stuck with something forever. We can change it, and that keeps us from having revolutions and having to have a Constitution every 17 years or so. That's one of the principles of stability that really helps the people.
So the Constitution being found on principles, not on specific details, but on general principles of government, then giving the people the ability to come in and say, hey, we want something to be different. And a lot of people would argue, well, it's a democracy because everybody gets to vote. Well, we do believe that every citizen who's a part of the United States, who is of legal age, should be able to vote, and actually they should vote. But we also understand that we don't want a situation where people can be swayed by emotions, making a rash decision that next week you changed your mind about. And so there is a very, very big process to get something done, but the fact that you have the ability to change it means you don't have to throw it away and start again. As you're mentioning, most nations every 17 years on average is what a constitution lasts. America's been a little different in those regards.
We have been different, and we've actually utilized a lot of principles that were not being used at the time in other nations. Now, certainly our Constitution has 3 branches of government, and that's nothing new. And actually, across history, a lot of countries have had those 3 branches. So that's not really unique, but when you go way back early in the Bible talks about those 3 branches. Isaiah 33:22. It says, the Lord is our lawgiver and our judge and our king. Well, there's your 3 branches. You have the legislative branch, you have the judicial branch, and you have the executive branch. So those 3 branches have been there, but America took the 3 branches and did something that had not been done to that point in any major constitution. We said we think there should be a separation of those 3 branches in such a way that they can check and balance each other. So instead of them all being under the king, or instead of them all being under one body, we broke them out and we said we want one branch to be able to stop the other 2. Now, that was based on a biblical precept, and a lot of our founding fathers who signed the Constitution. So in the American system, we really believe that you should separate powers, and a lot of our founding fathers, guys who helped give us the Constitution and ratify it, talked about that. I mean, signers of the Constitution like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, talked about a biblical principle that caused us to separate powers. And John Adams even has writings where that he points to Jeremiah 17:9 as the reason that America came up with separation of powers.
Sure. And specifically, John Adams says the reason we should separate powers is because the heart of man is wicked and deceitful and can't be trusted. Now, we mentioned that's Jeremiah 17:9. Actually, John Adams didn't say, well, Jeremiah 17:9 tells us. No, he just quoted Jeremiah 17:9. Actually, there were 3 different letters where he says the heart of man is wicked and deceitful. It can't be trusted. We can't centralize power. And there's a history throughout the world when people have power, there's a notion that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the history of the world is full of examples when people get in power, oftentimes their heart goes in the wrong direction, that they do things they shouldn't do, and corruption ensues. And this is why the founding fathers said, well, we can't just have centralized power. They'd seen tyranny under the king. Well, there were actually people appointed by the king in America, whether it was governors, whether it was judges, and really across every single branch, as we're talking about, there's 3 branches. In all 3 of those branches, they had seen tyranny, they'd seen oppression, and they said, we want something where if you see tyranny in one of those branches, if you see oppression from one of those branches, if you see the judges doing something, then you ought to be able to have your legislators. You ought to be able to have your executive branch, whether it's the king or a president or whoever that person is in that nation. They ought to be able to say, hey, you're not doing the right thing, and vice versa between all 3 branches. That way, if ever one goes bad, the other 2 hopefully don't go bad at the same time, and then can say, hey, you need to stop what you're doing. That's not the right thing.
And that really is not only a reflection of the principles out of the Bible, it's also illustrated in history. As they look back over European history for 1,000 years, if you look at the judicial system, man, they had Star Chamber courts and High Commissioner courts and Admiralty courts, and none of them were after justice. They were all political arms of the state. So whoever the national leader was, whoever the national legislature was, they used the courts not to get justice, but to cause a political agenda to come forward. And what you have with that, if you've got a really good king, like in the Bible, a King David, oh, that's good, people prosper. If you got a really bad king, like King Zedekiah, also in the Bible, that's a really bad thing, and the people are in trouble. And so what we did in America was we really focused government on the good of the people and making sure that the people got served rather than political interest, because again, we're a government of laws, not of men.
Well, it's even interesting, the idea of what we call public officials in America, they're known as public servants. And so even if you're elected as a leader, if you have a leadership position, even if you are the president of the United States of America, you still are known as a public servant. The reason is you've been chosen to serve the people in a certain capacity. So it was not an idea that you are the executive and you can do whatever you want and we are all subservient to you. No, in fact, we chose you to serve us, and if you don't do a good job serving us, we're going to get rid of you and we're going to elect somebody else next election who does a better job, because we really had this idea that people in authority are not an absolute power, because we recognize that there's actually a God above them, and so they're not God of the universe. They actually are just one of us that we have chosen, and this goes back to the idea of a Republican form of government. In a Republican form of government, you actually get to choose your leaders, and actually, you choose them from among you. So I don't have to choose them. Well, you can only choose them from the best college in your nation, and if they're not from that college, they can't be a leader. No. In America, we said, no, you can choose your farmer neighbor. You can choose the neighbor who actually is a roofer. You can choose the neighbor who's a mechanic. You can choose anybody to be the leader, and as long as the people get behind and support that person, they vote for him, they can be the leader. So you didn't have to be someone of an elevated position to be a leader, but we recognized if we are choosing you, we're choosing you because we think you'll do the best job serving and representing us in that capacity, which is also very different from most of the world.
That is very different, and the concept of servant leadership is very different, and the concept is very different too, in that America, we expect integrity and high quality of standards. Corruption is very, very, very common in the world, but because the Founding Fathers did believe that the heart of man can be corrupt so fast, and if God doesn't get involved with the heart of man, it's going to do the wrong thing, because of that, we put a lot of accountability into what we did with government. As a matter of fact, as you look at some of the state constitutions, and by the way, the states, the colonies had constitutions long before we had a national constitution. For example, states like Connecticut, 150 years before we did the American National Constitution, the federal constitution, Connecticut had its own state colony constitution, and the other states did as well. So we believe that you should have written documents that limit the people and the leaders. It should be a limited government. That's one of the things we espouse is that government is not God. It has a limited role. And so out of those written constitutions, we learned a lot of things. And so one of the interesting provisions that often appears in the very early constitutions, and by the way, when America, during the American War for Independence, when we separated from Great Britain, we found ourselves having to change governments, because for all those years we had British Crown-appointed governors and we had governments by the British Crown. But now we are free American citizens and we have to create our own constitutions. So starting in 1776, they start writing constitutions, and different founding fathers did so. And a provision that you often find in there is that no one is allowed to hold public office unless they believe in a future state of rewards and punishments. Now, why would that be a requirement to hold office, is that you have to believe in a future state of rewards and punishments?
Sure. Well, one of the things that certainly we can look at, the idea of accountability, and the founding fathers, we can document very well what they thought about this. But they thought if you don't believe one day you will be rewarded or punished based on believing there's some kind of eternity, then why would you believe you have to do the right thing here? If you think that this life is all there is, then it would make sense that you live life trying to get everything you can out of life. Whatever benefits you the most is what you're going to do. But if you believe there is a creator who created you, something above you, and one day you have to stand before that creator and give an account for what you did, and well, you treated this person this way and you stole from that person, they said, okay, if you have to give an account for everything you do, well, then I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, because one day I'm going to have to stand before the great creator and explain what I did. If you know you have to stand before God one day and give a defense for everything you did or didn't do, it will make you think a little bit differently. And especially in the political structure of America, most of what happens in politics doesn't happen in public where everybody sees it.
Yeah, you're right. Most of the things that go with the government do not happen in public where people see them. They actually happen in private where most citizens don't see them. As a matter of fact, in America, most Americans might be able to name 24 laws a year that get passed by the federal Congress. However, in an average session of Congress, they introduce between 10 and 13,000 bills every session of Congress. Most Americans don't know about that. If you don't have individuals that say, you know what, I better be careful what I do, because while the people may not be aware of this, God certainly is, and I'll have to answer to Him for it. If you don't have that awareness throughout the culture, it is very hard to have a servant-oriented government that is not corrupt. And that's one of the things we've worked on in America.
Well, and certainly one of the things even John Adams talked about the American Constitution. He said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And the idea was, in America, it really only works if you have a moral foundation in the people. Now, why would that be the case?
You know, it's interesting that people, if they are not moral, if they are themselves not kind of servant-oriented, they will grab everything they want, and they will elect people like them who will grab everything. And that's why governments often don't last long. They will go into bankruptcy because they've all stripped the money out of it, or they will start creating laws for their own good, not for the good of others. And so when you look at electorates and how they elect leaders, if you elect leaders that reflect the morals of the culture, which oftentimes change, and they may change from election to election, you don't have the stability you need. That's why one of the fixed principles of government is you have to have a fixed moral standard of rights and wrongs from which truth is derived, that establishes truth. And if you get to the point where, well, I really don't like that moral standard, it inhibits me. If you start dropping your moral standard, your leaders will start dropping their moral standards. It becomes more selfish, more self-centered, egocentric. I'll pass laws for my own benefit, and while I'm passing a law over here, I'll talk to this guy to give me some money over here, and I'm going to make sure that this law helps me. And we see that corruption happens in America, and it generally happens from people who lose that cognizance of they're going to account to God, and they're there to serve the people, not serve themselves.
Well, it's interesting, too, even the idea of America, we really believe in freedom. In fact, part of the American ideal and dream is that you can be your own person. You can do your own thing. There's a lot of liberty. But liberty and freedom really only work if you have a moral basis. And it should be common sense for most people in the world. If you give freedom to immoral people, what are they going to do? Immoral things, right? If you give freedom to a murderer and they are a known murderer, what are they likely going to do? Commit murder. So you really can't give freedom to people you know are not moral. So freedom only works if you have moral people. And by the way, if you try to give freedom to people, and there's a lot of theft and a lot of murder and there's rape and there's all kinds of bad things, the only logical response is you need a really strong government to come in to kind of control the situation, and that's where you lose freedom in a strong government. Freedom only works if there is a system of morality, which is why for the Founding Fathers, it wasn't just even the idea that we need moral leaders, we need a moral people. Because the whole notion of our government, not just that we get to elect officials, not just that they're bound by a constitution, but also we believe in freedom. But freedom only works if we can agree, let's not murder each other. Let's not steal from each other. Let's not have adultery where we're sleeping with somebody else's spouse. Let's not, right? There has to be a system of morality. And this is why for the founding fathers, they actually pointed to the Bible in a lot of cases, not because necessarily they were all Christians, although many of them were Christians, but they weren't all Christians. But the reason they pointed to the Bible was because it was a moral foundation. Actually, I would argue there's no higher moral teachings than the teachings of Jesus. So even founding fathers who didn't believe Jesus was a son of God could still say we should follow his teachings because that's the best morals for a nation to operate.
When you take something as simple as the golden rule, which Jesus delivered that says, do to others what you want done to yourself. If you have leaders who have that belief, if they will pass laws for others like they would want laws to be passed for them, if they were the citizen and not the legislator, what kind of laws would they want to live under? Well, when you start thinking about others more than yourself, that's a moral standard that elevates everyone. And when you have the teaching that Jesus gives of the Good Samaritan, that you don't know this person, but he's been injured, you need to reach out and help them, that creates benevolence. And that's one of the reasons that America is one of the most benevolent nations in the world. Just last year, $400 billion given by private citizens to help those in need across the world. That comes from the teachings of Jesus. So we believe that you...
And by the way, I would even argue that a lot of people who have given that money, they probably weren't Christians.
You're right.
So they're not thinking, I'm following the teachings of Jesus. But they've grown up in a culture that promotes you should help people in need. They've grown up in a culture that says you should do unto others what you would want them to do unto you. You should love your neighbors yourself. There's a lot of principles that you don't have to be a Christian to live in America. In fact, many people in America aren't Christians. They don't even believe in Jesus, and yet they follow teachings from Jesus because that was a foundation that America was built on. And this is where, as we talk about the $400 billion that was given, it's not because people said, I really want to be like Jesus. No, it's because we've promoted a system of benevolence, and the benevolence that was from the moral standards of Christianity, but that benevolence has really defined a lot of American lives. And it's not because they're Christians or love Jesus, but there was a moral standard that they chose to follow, which we can back up. The founding fathers said you have to base it on morality. There's no higher morals in the teachings of Jesus. So that's a lot of what we did in America. It was based on those moral teachings, not just because you had to believe in Jesus, not because if you weren't a Christian, we're kicking you out. No, because our Constitution actually says you can't even require somebody to be of a certain faith or religion to hold office, that there can be no religious litmus test, no requirement. You can be secular and hold office, but you do have to believe and uphold a standard of morality. You do have to believe in the limitations of the Constitution. So there are beliefs you have to have, but we didn't require people to be religious, although there was religious principles we did require them to follow.
Well, you know, you talked about the limitations of the Constitution. And the American Constitution actually came about in two parts. The first was the Constitution itself, which says, here's what government can do. And it was very limited. We believed in America, and history taught that the bigger the government, the less the freedom of the people. And so the smaller the government, the more limited it was, the more freedom you had, the more individuals could go out and be entrepreneurs and get involved in things, get the benefit of their own rewards. If they worked hard, they get the benefit of it. So what the federal Constitution did was it said, federal government, there's only 15 things you're allowed to do. They're called enumerated powers. It says, here's what the government can do. It says, other than that, what we're going to do is everything else belongs to the people and to the states. So government is not God. You don't run everything in a person's life. There's 15 things you can do. Now, the second part of the Constitution came just a couple of years after that because people said, you know, we need even more limits on the government. We've said what they can do. We need to say what they can't do. And so we call that the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights says, here are rights that come to every person from our Creator. And government, you cannot interfere with those rights because they belong to every individual. So whether it's the First Amendment right of conscience, the right of assembly, the right of petition, the right of speech, whether it's the Second Amendment right of self-defense or the Third Amendment right of the sanctity of your own home or the Fourth or the Eighth Amendments, what we call the due process rights. This is where you get justice when you get into the legal system, because all over Europe you didn't get justice in the legal system. You got a political agenda, but in America, no. The people have a right to justice when they go to the legal system. And so that's the two parts of the Constitution we had, and they were both designed to make sure that we had limited government and that the people had the right to exercise the rights that God himself gave them.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that part of the Bill of Rights, one of the things we said related to the Constitution, is they can only do those certain 15 things, but the Bill of Rights said, but there are other things that states can do, there are other things individuals can do apart from the federal government. So the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution of America, really only applied to the federal government. Here are 15 things you can do. The Bill of Rights said, here are things, federal government, you cannot touch. At that point in America, that actually didn't even apply to states because we recognize there's a hierarchy of government. And actually, so for local government, we might have mayors. We might have a governor of the state. We might have a state assembly, a state legislature. But then in America, we have a president. We have a Congress. We have a federal government. And so our U.S. Constitution says federally, this is how it operates. But we still believe that states had rights to do things. And so states could say things, even though at that time, it might not be what the federal Constitution says. Your state could do something different because we still believed in states' rights, what's known as state sovereignty. But we thought states ought to be able to have some rights. And you mentioned individuals too, because in our Bill of Rights, it says, here are things the federal government can never violate. The federal government can never come to me and say, hey, you're not allowed to talk about things in public anymore because you keep saying things about this leader. You say how you don't like this leader. We're tired of you talking about not liking this leader. You're not allowed to talk anymore. Federal government can't come and tell you lose your freedom of speech. Federal government can't come and say, hey, you've been going to this church and we don't like religion. We don't like what you've been doing, so you're not allowed to go to your church anymore. You can only do what we tell you. We said, no. The federal government can't interfere with your religion. They can't interfere with your speech. They can't tell you can't defend yourself if someone is coming to attack you. If someone means to do you violent harm, well, you can't fight back. Yeah, you can. This was something we thought was a self-evident truth. It was obvious if you just studied creation. You could look and go, wait a second. Everything in creation has some level of self-defense. Maybe it flies, maybe it runs, it has claws, it has fangs. It does something to try to prevent the attack. And we said, we believe people ought to have a right to self-defense if somebody is coming to attack them, to do them harm, to hurt their family. But we thought there were rights. And as you mentioned, the federal government cannot interfere with these rights because, even as you mentioned, the federal government was only supposed to do a few specific things, contrary to some nations when the government is unlimited. It can do whatever it wants. It has all the power. It tells the people what they're doing. We actually told the government what it could and couldn't do. So this is very unique because what we understood is government didn't create man, man created government. So if we're the ones that establish government, we're the ones that get to tell government what they can and can't do.
One of our founding fathers, James Wilson, said in Europe, government is the master. In America, the people are the master. And so we reverse that. And you talked about the federal government and the state and local governments, and that's a concept called federalism. And under federalism, you have governments at various levels, and each has its own jurisdiction. There are 15 things the federal government can do, and by the way, the federal government has a constitution, and it has 3 branches. At the state level, there are certain things the state government can do, and by the way, it has a constitution, and it has 3 branches. And then when you get down to the city level has a constitution, sometimes a charter, but there's a written document that it governs itself by, and it has 3 branches. You have city municipal judges, you have city council, and you have a mayor. So we have federalism all the way down. And the other thing you mentioned was that a lot of people in America are not necessarily religious, but they uphold these rights. And a great example in looking at inalienable individual rights, one of the justices on the American Supreme Court is one of the most secular members of the Supreme Court in the history of the United States. And he says, well, the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights, they come out of the Bible. Now, here's a guy who's not a Christian, don't even know that he believes in God, but he recognizes that what we have in America called the due process rights, this is what happens when you go into court. You have a right to have an attorney, you have a right to trial by jury, you have a right to confront your accuser, you have a right to compel witnesses in your behalf. All of this comes out of the Bible. How is that?
Now, wait a second. Yeah, because I've read the Bible a few times, and I don't recall seeing a chapter on due process, right? So even one of the things that I think is very practical when somebody says, hey, this is what's true, we always ought to ask the question, how do you know? Right? We always ought to be people pursuing truth. That way we don't just let somebody lie to us. We don't let a government official say, well, this is what's true. How do we know? Right? How do we know that's true? Do you have a source for that? What do you base that on? So we ought to ask the question, so if this really secular justice is saying that all of our due process from the American Bill of Rights came out of the Bible. Again, I've read the Bible. I've never seen a chapter on due process. So how do we know it came out of the Bible?
Interestingly enough, we have books like this. Now, if you happen to be an American attorney that wants to practice in an American federal court of law, you have what's called Federal Practice and Procedure. This tells you how to practice federal law and federal courts. And in this particular volume, volume 30, which means there's a whole lot of volumes. this is, it goes to the other side.
That's a lot of reading to be a lawyer.
That's a lot of reading. That's a lot of reading. Volume 30 deals with due process. And as you get on the inside, it has a long section, historically, on the verses of the Bible that were used to create due process in the American system of justice. And as the book points out, so much of it goes back to what's called the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible, this Bible happens to be from 1599, but Geneva Bible was a little different. It's an English language Bible, but what makes it significant is all these little commentaries that go down the side right here. Because what had happened was the Bible had been put away from the common man for 1,000 years. Only the elite could have access to the Scripture. This is the first Bible that can be owned and read by the common man. And as they started reading the Bible, they said, oh my gosh, we haven't been doing this for 1,000 years. And so the commentaries are from leaders across Europe who said, we've been doing the courts wrong. We've been doing government wrong. We've been doing schools wrong. We've been doing economy
for example,
wrong.
In the American courts, you have the right to confront your accuser. So someone can't just say, you're a witch, we should put you to death, and everybody goes, oh yeah, let's kill witches because those are bad, and they would put you to death. No, we said you should be able to confront your accuser. If someone brings an accusation against you, you should say, wait a second, who's accusing me of being a witch, and why do they think that? What proof do they? You should be able to confront the accuser. So where would something like that come from?
Well, as this federal book points out, and as the Bible affirms, it actually goes back to chapter 8 in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is with a woman who's been accused of a crime, and Jesus turns and says, woman, where are your accusers? In other words, you get to face your accusers.
And actually the woman was brought to Jesus because people wanted to see Jesus actually condemn her because she was wrong, she committed a crime, and the mob was there against her, and the mob is saying, do something. And
they've accused her of something.
Right. He says, okay, wait a second. He's looking around, and he says, who's the one accusing you? And all of a sudden it was quiet. All of a sudden nobody was there to accuse her anymore. And he says, well, if they're not here to condemn you, he says, I'm not going to condemn you. He says, now, don't do the wrong thing anymore. Go on your way. But the interesting thought was, if there's nobody there to accuse you, when you get to confront your accusers, if you can say, okay, who's bringing the charge against me? And there's nobody, well, that makes a difference. And one of the things, too, it's even another principle, is that one side sounds good.
That's right.
Until you hear the other side. It's easy for someone to come and make a claim and say, hey, you've done wrong, and you're a terrible person, and you've probably stolen your life, and we should put you in prison. It's easy for someone to make a bunch of accusations, but if you're able to defend yourself, if you can present the other side of the story, it might make a difference in what the outcome of that trial might be, because it's not just a one-sided case, and that's part of confronting your accuser, is allowing you to present the other side of the issue.
That also goes to the clause in the Constitution that says you get to compel witnesses in your behalf, because what you're talking about goes back to Proverbs 18:17, where it said one side sounds good until the other side cross-examines him in court. And so you get one side and they can make a really condemning case, and the other side said, yeah, but you left out all these facts of, oh yeah, and so when the jury hears that, they see what truth is. And so all of due process is meant to establish truth. Tim, you mentioned how that they said, oh, you're a witch. Well, do you know America had witch trials? We had people put to death. We had 27 people put to death in America for accused of being a witch. And the way that those witch trials came to an end in America were 3 Christian leaders, 2 pastors and a Christian layman, went to the governor with the Bible. And they took the Bible and they held the Bible and said, you know, we're doing what Europe did, but we're not doing what the Bible says. You get to confront your accusers. We're using hearsay evidence. We don't have any open testimony, and we're not allowing them to compel witnesses in their behalf. And so the governor shut down the trials. Now, it's interesting that in America, we have that blemish, no question, 27 people put to death. What's also interesting is at the same time in Europe, there were 500,000 put to death in the witch trials. So when you look at the Bible, it brought due process. It stopped some atrocities, even though by practice we were doing what Europe was doing. Let's do what they're doing. That's our practice and experience. No, the Bible is different. And so that's why even a secular justice on the Supreme Court can say, well, the Bible is what gave us our due process clause.
And I think it's just a great point and case of when you look throughout the history of the world, no nation's ever been perfect. Every nation has had bad leaders. Every nation has had problems at some point in their time. But this is why the Founding Fathers thought morality was such an important part of the nation, because if you don't have a moral base, it doesn't matter what kind of laws you write. If you don't have people that understand basic right and wrong, you can't pass enough good laws to help them live correctly and still enjoy freedom. Now, you can have a very tyrannical government. You can have a police officer on every single corner of the street to enforce laws, but people aren't going to enjoy freedom. We understood freedom only works if you have a moral people. Our Constitution in America really was designed to give people the freedom to have their family, to have property, to be an entrepreneur, to have their business. We really believed in freedom, but even today, we see that we're having a lot of issues in America. And I would argue it's not because the flaws of the Constitution are being exposed. I would argue, no, it's because the morals of the people have changed, and freedom really only works when you have that moral base, which is part of when you look at the success of our Constitution. It was found on principles that make sense. It was found you have different branches. They all have different responsibilities. They all do different things. And even some of the brilliant things we did when it came to the way we elected officials, where we had the House and the Senate. And so in our U.S. Congress, our House, it was based on population. It was based on however many people you had in your community. That was how many representatives you got. And so that was the idea, was based on population. You would have representatives. Well, then in our U.S. Senate, every state, regardless of their population, gets 2 senators. So your state might have 100 representatives, only 2 senators. Your state might have 1 representative and 2 senators, because the idea was we thought, no, we ought to have something that actually represents the majority of the people, but something that represents the state's interest. There was a lot of really brilliant things we did in the Constitution, but ultimately it's not just the principles that have made America be able to last so long under the Constitution. It's the fact that we actually promoted a system of morality that allowed freedom to prevail. And one of the things that actually, even as we're talking about the morality of the people, one of the things that matters, and one of the reasons that the Founding Fathers put limitations on government, generally if something's going to go wrong or go bad, if you look at morality, if we say, hey, the people no longer know what's right and wrong, you don't see a culture go into chaos and anarchy as quickly as you generally see a government become tyrannical. And so what our Constitution in America did is we said, we want to make sure that we put boundaries on government to prevent tyranny from prevailing. And that was largely because a lot of the examples that we had seen in history was tyrannical, oppressive governments. There's not as many cases in history of anarchy causing as many problems as there were tyrannical governments causing so many problems. So we said we want to promote morality so freedom works, but we also want to put really good limits on government, because if something's going to go bad first, it's probably not going to be the people as much as it's going to be a government. So we said, okay, we're going to make sure we limit what government can do, the authority, the power they have. And so by limiting that power and authority, it's actually kept a lot of tyranny from growing as quickly in America as it's grown in other nations.
Yeah, you're right. And this is exactly why we have a written document, a written Constitution, so that we can know what the boundaries are, we can know what the limits are, we can know what our leaders are supposed to do, not supposed to do, what our rights are, what we have a right to do. But if you don't know what's written down, if you don't know what's there, people can come along and tell you anything else, and you can believe that, and you'll end up not doing the right thing. A great example of this is what happens in the federal courts in America. Americans are told all the time that federal judges have lifetime appointments. Great, except the Constitution says they do not. The Constitution says they can serve for the duration of good behavior. If they don't behave well, you take them off the court. I didn't know we could take judges off. Do you know the Constitution of the United States gives more provisions on how to remove a judge than anything else in the Constitution? People don't know that, so they allow judges to make laws. Judges don't make laws, legislators do. But if you don't know the document, you have a completely different form of government. Another great example, we're told in America, oh, you can't have religion in public life. There's a separation of church and state in the First Amendment. That's not what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment says that we have a guarantee to be able to express our religion, including publicly. But we're told just the opposite. And this is actually something with human nature that goes all the way back to the time of Jesus. Jesus, back at that time, the religious leaders, he said, you guys don't know the Scriptures, and therefore you're missing the power of God. So many times Jesus talked about you need to know the Scriptures. Well, you need to know the Constitution of your country. In fact, we have a founding father who really focused on this, and he says every citizen ought to diligently read and study the Constitution and teach the rising generation to be free. If you know the Constitution, it provides freedom. When you don't know the Constitution, they will take freedoms away from you, and you don't realize they're being taken because you don't know what the freedom is. But that's the key, is maintaining freedom, teaching those principles of freedom, including to the next generation.
Yeah, teaching them to be free, I think, is one of the most significant things, because a lot of times we think, well, people want to be free. They know what freedom is. That's not always the case, and you have to teach people how to be free. This is why in America we thought we need to teach people a system of morality. We need to show them the boundaries. Why should you read and study the Constitution? So you know what the government can do, and then our Bill of Rights says what they can't do. Freedom is not something that everybody just has automatically in their nation. It actually has to be taught. And what makes America so unique is that we were a nation for a long time that promoted the right kind of principles and taught the next generation to be free. What I would encourage is you need to figure out what are principles of freedom and how can we apply them in our nation.